Good afternoon, and welcome to a very special edition of Black Press USA Live. Today, we have brought in our president and CEO, the civil rights icon and member of the famed Wilmington 10, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr., to lead this important discussion about the case for reparations. Joining us is former Democratic presidential candidate Tom Steyer, who has long demonstrated a commitment to combating climate change, fighting for racial justice, and putting people and not corporations in charge of our democracy. And we have Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee, the author of H.R. 40 and one of the most influential and forceful voices in Washington. She is serving her 13th term as a member of the United States House of Representatives, representing the 18th Congressional District of Texas, which is centered in Houston. Welcome, everyone, and let's have a great discussion. I'm sure we will.
Well, thank you very much, Stacey, and Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee. Shout out to you. We appreciate your leadership and the fact that you've authored this important bill on reparations, H.R. 40. We definitely want to get into the details. And Tom Steyer's, we're always pleased to have an exchange with you. If we had more voices like yours, Tom, across the country, our country would be a better place. So let me get right into it. Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee, if there's ever a time that I think we could push to get the reparations bill through Congress, it is now. People talk about Black Lives Matter, Black communities matter, all of America matters, but certainly the repair of the damage that has been done because of all of the systemic racism that still conditions our country today, even amidst this pandemic. So please give us your view as the author of H.R. 40. What are our chances, Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee? Can we get this through to Congress?
Dr. Chavis, what a pleasure to be with you. And let me thank you for your storied history and you're willing to sacrifice your life for the realm of justice, the ring of justice, the mountain of justice. And we thank you so very much. We thank NNPA for its far reach of spreading the good word. Thank you to Tom Steyer as well. It has been a pleasure, to see the passion in which he chose to run his campaign, not for self. We say that in the faith community, not for self, but for others. And what I've seen of Tom Steyer, he has always evidenced an intellectual and compassionate stand for others rather than self. Thank you, Tom, so very much for being with me. And if I might, thank you for that very mighty endorsement of H.R. 40. Stacey, thank you for your journalism and certainly the word that you are presenting to the American people. Let me start from the perspective that there's someone who will be a skeptic that is listening to us. And so my message, Dr. Chavis, is to that skeptic. And to be able to say that all is well. John Lewis, the headline in the New York Times, said he was willing to risk his life for justice, was an enthusiastic supporter of H.R. 40, the commission to study and develop reparations, which has been introduced since 1989 by the Honorable John Conyers. We thank all of these pioneering icons for understanding that H.R. 40 was evidence of international law. Why should we be afraid of laws that have been utilized in the international arena and utilized effectively? When there is a harm, when there is an injurious injury, when the injury is so devastating, we know that the law allows restoration and repair. That is what H.R. 40 is. No one can deny that African Americans, though they tried to enslave Native Americans, and we certainly acknowledge their particular predicament in this country, but no one can deny that the descendants of enslaved Africans remain in bondage over 200 years. No one would deny that. It is a factual basis of America's history. But what comes into conflict and question is what happened afterwards. The Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863, but 250,000 people, Dr. Chavis, were left enslaved until the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth, when General Granger came to this area of the nation. So the question about why not now is we've waited this many years, centuries we've waited, There's never been an apology or an acknowledgement of the foundation of this nation built on slaves and slave labor. In fact, African Americans, in all of the brutality that we've experienced, have never really chronicled our history so that it is of public knowledge. Do you know that we helped build this country, or maybe some would say built this country? Cotton became king only because of us, because it was unpaid labor with no overhead, no workman's comp, no insurance, no salary. And then we went on to be freed of sorts with no compensation that was attempted to be done by General Sherman's proposal. We never got the 40 acres and a mule. I always tell people that is not humorous. It was not a joke. It sounded somewhat humorous today, but it was actually wealth transfer. We never got a wealth transfer. We were never able to transfer that wealth. And I believe as people understand that, and in the midst of Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Movement, which, by the way, are enthusiastic supporters, the Black Lives Movement, along with national organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League, but the sponsors of the bill represent an amazing cross-section of the United States Congress. In fact, I'm amazed every day. We have Southerners, we have Midwesterners, we have Californians, the whole East Coast. We have those from the original 13 colonies, and of course, we have members from the Deep South. We continue to work and edify and educate people about where we are. So
well, thank you.
It is extremely important to acknowledge that it is possible to pass it now.
Very good. And of course, on behalf of Karen Carter Richards, our chairman of our board, who's your homegirl right there in Houston, Texas, the distinguished publisher of the Houston Forward Times, I commit to you that the Black press, we're going to help spread the word about HR 40. We're going to be mobilizing. You know, we got to make sure that we have a great voter turnout this year. Make sure everybody's counted in the census. But we're also making sure in the same breath that we support HR 40. Tom Steyer, I'm going to like for you to comment. You've been moving around the country, first as a vice presidential candidate, then as a leader in your own right for civil rights and for human rights. How do you see the prospects for HR 40?
Well, Dr. Chavis, thank you very much for the question. I'm really here to support Representative Jackson Lee.
Yes.
You know, when I was running for president, I talked about the need for reparations for the descendants of enslaved people every single day. And I believe that our history and the structural racism that has been part of our history for centuries was hiding in plain sight, which is why I tried to talk about it every single day, and why I believe now, with the unrest that has followed the murder of George Floyd, that this is a particularly opportune time for me and for other people to support Representative Jackson Lee and to push the case for the study and development of reparations. And I feel as if this is a value-driven question. It is something that affects every single American in terms of our dealing with the truth of our history and working together to solve the injustice, the structural injustice, which we continue to see on a daily basis. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic where African Americans are dying at a disproportionate rate as a result of hundreds of years of injustice and structural racism. And I feel as if this is a time when it's in front of us, when it couldn't be more obvious, more relevant, more important. And that is why I'm so enthusiastic about what the Congresswoman is doing and so enthusiastic about trying to reach out to support her and her efforts and really to stand up what I believe are basic American values about equity, equality, and justice.
Well, thank you. That's a good segue back to Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee. We've seen with the pandemic what is referred to as comorbidities. The morbidities that in fact, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, lung disease. We have all of these asthma. 60% of the children in Harlem have asthma. So the point I'm going to make is that these comorbidities just didn't fall out of the sky as a result of structural racism, as Tom Steyer has mentioned. In H.R. 40, how will the bill apply to dealing with some of these long-term health disparities as well as other disparities that are prevalent? You know, unfortunately, Black people, we've been, no matter what the issue arises, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's financial services, we are being systematically discriminated against. How does H.R. 40 deal with systemic and systematic and institutionalized racism?
Well, Mr. President, it has to deal with that systemic approach. Many of you might have seen me questioning General Barr.
Yes.
To my dismay, he did not seem to comprehend systemic racism, institutional racism, certainly found in the criminal justice system. I gave a early rendering of slavery just for the reason of leading into the 21st century that Tom Steyer has so aptly done. Your question is relevant because here we are in the 21st century, and the remnants of our history as the descendants of enslaved Africans are catching up with us or never left. This commission, hands will not be tied. It will be funded. We might even raise the amount of dollars that we have funded. It will not be a pie in the sky. It will be a working commission. That's why we have amended it to include study and develop. It will be a simultaneous action, studying our life here in the United States, but developing proposals based on the scientific, economic, health, educational, political, and psychological status of African Americans now. We'll look at every feature of it. We just had a CBC meeting on researchers in the Black community, or research, or African American researchers.
Yes.
Through the ages, we have been had a dual problem. One, our skepticism of research because of the Tuskegee experiment and many others. And then we are missing in research because of that apprehension and fear. We have not been utilized in clinical trials. What does that mean? So if there is a separate analysis for African Americans in terms of our DNA, for how you treat cancer, how you treat subsets of cancer, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer. As you well know, we have a high instance of cancer. We have a high instance of the impact of environmental injustice, so that we have a lot of respiratory illnesses. We have diabetes because of the food we're relegated to. All that has to deal with how you respond to the question of reparations. So I think that's an important question. That's what this commission will do. That's why I want people to be unafraid of this commission. I have to ask the question, as Robert Kennedy said, some people ask the question, why? Why do I have to sign on to HR 40? And I want to give the answer, why not? Because we will not get to the point of not speaking about this in the 22nd century, looking at the same body of people, their descendants, of course, and saying, well, why is it that we're in the criminal justice system? Why is it that we've been the victims of mass incarceration? Why are young school children in the juvenile justice system? And finally, why is it when I left Washington and the news headlines was African-American woman in Washington, D.C. makes 51 cents on the dollar, and a Anglo woman, and we know women are discriminated against across the board, makes 89 cents, a Caucasian woman. Why are these consistent disparities there? Because we've never stopped and taken a comprehensive look at our status in this nation.
Well, thank you. I think that really calls out the work. Stacey, as a journalist, you may want to pose the next question to Tom Steyer, because you've been writing about reparations. And I think what Congresswoman Jackson Lee just said, the importance of not only having the research, but who does the research, who authorizes the research. Because very often, depending on who does the study, depending on who's paying for the study, unfortunately determines sometimes the outcome of the study. And so we want something rich and authentic that bears witness to the truth. And I agree with Congresswoman Shiela Jackson Lee. One of the reasons why America still has a race problem today in 2020, we have refused, we're in a denial about systemic racism. We're in denial about the disparities. We're in a denial about all of these inequalities that we certainly have an opportunity to straighten out. But Stacey, you can pose the next question to Tom.
Yeah, well, along those lines, Dr. Chavis, thank you. Tom Steyer, the Congresswoman mentioned that uh, as far as reparations, the 40 acres and a mule, that as she says, some laugh about it, and it's no joke. And really, it was the slave owners who got the reparations. Why is it that people can't seem to comprehend that? Mainstream America, if you will, can't seem to comprehend that. And the other part of the question is, why has it been so difficult to get a president or even a congressional body to issue a formal apology?
Well, let me just say, Stacey, on the formal apology, I don't understand it. I think the other part of it, I'm going to try and explain, but the idea as to whether the United States owes an apology for hundreds of years of enslaving human beings seems to me like one of the all-time no-brainers. Of course, people are owed an apology. In terms of, I really want to support one of the things that the Congresswoman said about history. I think it's really important, and she did a brief explication of the history of African Americans' contribution in the United States. I think the story of injustice and contribution by the African American community is absolutely undertold, not understood broadly, particularly outside the African American community. And I think it's absolutely essential that that story be told right up to the present day, including John Lewis, including the distinguished people who I'm talking to today. Because I've always said the congressman referred to the work that was done of building America. But in fact, there's also it's imperative that Americans understand the moral leadership that has come from the African American community for literally hundreds of years, that we just witnessed with John Lewis, but that has by no means ended with John Lewis. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, the unrest around the murder of George Floyd, are further evidence of the kind of moral leadership that this country has benefited from for centuries and absolutely desperately demands right now. But let me say one thing. Now we're talking, that was to support the Congresswoman's point about understanding our history together. Let me say that why has it been so slow to get, and I'm not at all joking about 40 acres and a mule, a transfer of wealth, a repairing of the damage, an acceptance of the damage, and then a willingness to repair. And I hate to say this, but I think it's very clear why that's not happened. I think it's about money. I think that people don't want to do what's right because however HR 40 works out, whatever the study and development looks like, whether it's supporting HBCUs, whether it's going to the healthcare issues that the Congresswoman was referring to. And I can tell you that as someone who's traveled around the United States to the places where there's the greatest pollution and toxicity, the greatest impact on people's health and life expectancy. I have traveled overwhelmingly to African American communities and Latino communities. And I can tell you that in Fresno, one of the cities in my home state of California, the difference between West Fresno in life expectancy and North Fresno, which are 2 miles apart, is about 20 years of life expectancy, having to do with toxicity, air pollution, water pollution.
Yeah, Tom, too, to that point, it was Dr. Chavis back in, I believe it was the 80s, who coined the term environmental racism. We know that exists. We know that's been a problem for forever, right? And you also mentioned that money being the problem. Now, many African Americans argue that others who have been oppressed have been financially compensated.
Look, I think this is an unwillingness by people to confront what's due. That's what I think it has been. And I think it is 2 steps. One is to make the case historically, which, as the Congresswoman said, is a laydown. I don't think anybody can really dispute the case. I think it's important that it be told because a lot of people in my home state don't know what Jim Crow means, literally. So I think that case is really important. But I also believe that it's an acceptance that together, this is better for every single American. that if we don't deal with the injustice, the structural injustice and racism that's been at the heart of our society virtually forever, that unless we repair that together, we can't move on together. So I view this as a positive for every single American, not just for African Americans, not just as a measure of what's due specifically, but as a measure of what's fair, what's equitable, so that we all can move forward with the sense that we've actually tried to repair damage. Not that it will ever really be repaired, to be honest, but we've acknowledged indebtedness, we've acknowledged contribution, and we made a step under the Congresswoman's lead to try to deal with something that is literally centuries overdue.
Very good. Congresswoman Shiela Jackson-Lee, what about bipartisan support? Are you able to get some Republican support from across the aisle for H.R. 40 in 2020?
You know what's going to help do that? Thank you so very much. And Tom, thank you for that connectedness that you have so aptly done. And so as I speak about bipartisanship, I'm going to say how much spend my time in the papers that are under the tutelage and supervision of NNPA, the greatest journalistic communication vehicle for, in quotes, our people in the nation. So certainly I have a number of great papers right here in Houston, and you already mentioned your great leader and officer, and my dear friend, Karen Carter Richards, and of course, any number of other papers from the Defender, African American News, to news pages and beyond. But what I would say is we need to be on the headlines of those papers, because those papers are in the districts of people that Tom has just described that seem to have a difficult understanding, not only of the chronicled history, but of today. And I think stories that can be told one after another about the existing disparities in a historical context is going to help us. We yet do not have a Republican, but I'm an optimist. I believe there are no no's in my vocabulary unless it's something illegal. And so we are working steadfastly for people of good conscience to understand this basic concept. And the basic concept is repair and restoration. The other concept is that as the Japanese were harmed in World War II through internment, they were compensated by a Republican president, President Reagan, in the 1980s. It may have taken a while, but it is equally has taken us a while from the last century when this bill was filed to now. So we have had a history of reparations or repair. We did it with the Tuskegee victims in syphilis. We did it in Florida with, I believe, Rosewood. We have not done it with Tulsa. And we know that next year will be the 100th commemoration of the Tulsa race riots, where 300 African Americans were killed. And the mighty wealth of that community, which might have spread across the nation, was totally eliminated. Now, today in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's not 2 blocks, maybe 5 blocks, maybe a neighborhood. There is half a block of what was this bustling community. That is of current history, if you will, 1921. It breaks my heart and the pain that one can feel. When I have my press conferences dealing with testing, and I've opened 23 testing sites on COVID-19 in the inner city neighborhoods, trying to drive my state governments and local governments to reach out to people that maybe not want to go downtown or wherever else to get a test, or some small place. But the point is, I take a moment of silence for 160,000 dead Americans who have died of COVID-19. The brutality of slavery dwarfs that. It is a mountainous number. And in historical purposes, we died in the transatlantic slave trade, and we made 2 nations rich, two areas rich. North America, the United States in particular, and certainly parts of the Caribbean and South and Central America, but we made Europe rich because we made cotton king. And that transfer that Tom talks about, that wealth, we made cotton king, and that produced the banks and all of the money. So if my friends who are Republicans, who are conservatives, they certainly understand the idea of someone not protecting their wealth or not repaying someone who they owe. That's supposed to be their moral values. If that is the case, then HR 40 fits right into their wheelhouse. So we're going to work on Republicans. But I think Tom has really, by him traveling, he has seen the pain. God rest his soul. I just, between you, Ben, and all of those who were in this movement, I had an opportunity to come on the tail end of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and I went through North Carolina and South Carolina, going on plantations, trying to register people to vote, and I was shot at by a white brother sitting on a chair on that old general store with that tattered area for people to go vote. I would have been scared to vote. I went up there to find out, is this where people vote? Because I was, trying to be, I guess, Miss Smarty. As I was making my way back, brother, he started shooting. When I say brother, he was a white brother, if you will. I never ran so fast. But this is what people were dealing with, not in the 1800s. They were dealing with it as they were sharecroppers on those existing plantations in the South. So all I would say is, if you just open your eyes, as you all educate people where your papers are in areas where there are people from all persuasions, we will see the tide rise. But we want to get this bill to the floor this year because we want to frame it for what we hope will be a good year coming forward. So we want something called a markup, which goes to the committee, and then a floor opportunity.
Right. Which committee will the bill arise out of?
The Judiciary Committee.
Judiciary.
And, Eric Nadler and Steve Cohen are chairpersons on those committees that it comes through. As a senior member of the Judiciary, I want to thank them for being enormously supportive of this legislation and letting me guide it. We had that hearing in 2019, the 400th year of our existence in this nation. And let me just say, I want to hold this up. I want to do show and tell because we've got a national poll now that says the majority of Americans would support the U.S. Congress establishing this commission. And it breaks it down. Obviously, Democrats, 86%, and independents, 46% to 37%. So we're in the ballpark. We're working. I think Republicans have a percentage as well. But we've got a majority of Americans who support the idea of repair and restoration. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, the Black Press, we're going to initiate, and I'm announcing it on this program, a national public awareness campaign on reparations, on HR 40, led by the Black Press from this day forward. We want to make sure that this is in the consciousness, this is in the mindset, and the priorities, because we also are going to ask state legislatures to follow your lead at the federal legislation so that it can be a comprehensive lifting up reparations from a public policy perspective. But as you know, one of the things that Dr. King used to say to us in SCLC, Congresswoman, was that as we change laws, as we change policies, we also have to change the hearts of people. And I think that given what has happened in the wake of George Floyd, given the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, broadening out, I think in some cities, there are more white people carrying signs saying Black Lives Matter than Black people carrying signs. That's a healthy thing. I think that's good. If only Black people are calling for reparation, that's a problem. So I think that's why I want to salute your leadership, your outreach. And I just want to say that on behalf of the Black Press, on behalf of the NMPA, we're going to help generate a national prioritization to put HR 40 at the top of our legislative agenda.
I think that will be absolutely powerful. And if you could modify it to say a national call to action.
Yes.
And I think you will find, as Thomas said, if you just travel to throughout the nation, and you'll find pockets where no matter what racial background you are, that you cannot ignore. And here's a point that should be made, Mr. President. I'm not going to knock on Susie Smith's door and ask her for a check. This is the way you run a government. You run it efficiently and effectively.
Yes.
What does that mean? This commission will provide the kind of roadmap. We will not be asking citizens. What I did not highlight as I came, but I think you got a sense of it. Everything that happened are governmental actions under color of law. And so this commission deals with what the federal government did to a group of people, innocent group of people, through no fault of their own. We came in chains. And from the time that we came, from bondage to the failed compromise of the 1800s, failed Reconstruction, the horrors of Jim Crowism, the hanging fruit of 4,000 of us lynched, and then the horribleness of living in segregated America, whether you were up south or down south, east south or west south, no matter where you were, your black skin was the first thing that people saw. We didn't work around with a chip on our shoulder. We had George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. We had men and women that went to the United States military, came home to a second-class citizenship. My father was working on Madison Avenue as a cartoonist, unbelievable. When the men came back from the military, he was summarily fired, relegated to work in day labor to support us. I don't walk around, I walk around with pride that he worked like other Black men did to support their families in menial jobs when they were college graduates and various other leaders. We kept on keeping on, but the government has never apologized. The government has never taken the kind of travel through the nation as Tom Steyer did and seen every pocket of inhumanity in our communities. And people want to talk about Chicago and gun violence. There are some places where it is worse than others. And so the question has to be, what are you doing in those pockets where you said to Black men, there's nothing else for you to do? You haven't given them anything else to do. That's systemic racism. And so the nation, it will lift all boats. We'll lift the boats of Native Americans. We'll lift the boats of Hispanic and Latinx. We'll lift all boats if we begin to look at these sore points so that the economic, what we're so proud of, this capitalistic system that young people are rethinking, as I know that I am, in terms of how it translates. And I just want to say this, we're asking questions about the vaccine for COVID-19. How will it be distributed? We're frightened about what pockets will it get into?
Yes.
What people will it get to? So in 2020, we're asking those modern day questions because we just have not addressed the inequities in a country that we love. And we're all patriots. And we're patriots because we want our country to be better. And that's what I think a commitment to HR 40. I want to show and tell one more time. I'm showing and tell because Tom is with me, so I'm showing Tom Steyer. But I also want to show the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Mr. President, this is not the Black Conference of Mayors. You know, we love them. They have been working with us. This is the U.S. Conference of Mayors. In their conference this year, announced their support for HR 40. That's unbelievable.
Yes.
The U.S. Conference of Mayors.
So, Stacey, on our release for today's show, let's make sure that we note the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the other national entities that have come out to support HR 40. Tom, you know, I think that when people, I'm still, unfortunately, I run into people who say, well, why should I vote? And I think that as we approach the 2020 election in November, we need to reassert why people should vote. And I'm telling people in our communities, besides needing a change in the White House, we also need a change in our houses. We need a change in our communities. And so I'm telling people, vote for reparations, vote for turnout, vote for better health care, vote. But you got to say it, because a lot of times, particularly for our young millennials who are watching, we need a social media campaign, Congresswoman Shiela Jackson-Lee and Tom Steyer. We need an all multimedia campaign to raise the level of enthusiasm and embrace for reparations. Tom, when you were out there, how did you see the intersection between some of these issues that surrounding reparations?
Well, let me say this, Dr. Chavis. In my mind, there is no way to separate racial justice, from economic justice, and environmental justice. To me, there's a question about whether we are going to look at every single issue through that lens or not, because every single issue that I can think of has a deep structural injustice to it based around race. So, and let me say one other thing while we're on the topic, which is this. I started an organization 8 years ago, NextGen America, to engage young voters and encourage them to turn out as much as possible. It's the largest youth voter mobilization effort in American history, and it's the most diverse generation in American history. And I believe, and this specifically deals with reparations, I believe that when this diverse, progressive young generation votes, that they will take back this country, that they will turn the page on what I think of as a totally failed Republican experiment starting, really with Ronald Reagan, and get us back onto a progressive footing, really transformative across the board. And a big part of that is going to be about racial justice. That in fact, in order for us to support the Congresswoman and reparations as best we can, the first most important thing we can do, all of us, but in particular, people between the ages of 18 and 35, is to show up.
Exactly.
We all show up. I mean, I am an absolute believer in the broadest, most inclusive, most representative democracy.
Very
if we all show up, if Americans, as the Congresswoman was saying, if we all got our voice, HR 40 would pass.
Very good.
That means showing up and voting for the people who are progressive, who do stand for traditional American values, and who will, in fact, support the Congresswoman and across the board talk about truth and equity going forward. That's where we are right now. We're in crisis. Our democracy is at risk, and we can take it back, but we show up to do.
But thank you. I think your words are prophetic. They're on time. I yield to Stacey as we begin to wound up. I'm going to give you a chance to pose your question to the Congresswoman and to Tom.
Yeah, so as we are over time, and so we're going to let both of them go. But before we do, Congresswoman, I guess for both of you, first for Tom and then to the Congresswoman. Tom, what can we expect you doing going forward to help continue to move this legislation? And Congresswoman, what can viewers do to help move the legislation forward?
Well, let me just say, I am here on this legislation to support the Congresswoman. We will be going out. Our need to impeach list is over 8 million people. We have been engaging them. We will engage them. Our staff will continue to talk to members of Congress to support the Congresswoman. But, she obviously is somebody who has great influence there and great relations there. Our job is simply to support her. But we will also speak to other outside advocacy organizations to try and encourage them. I'm sure virtually all of our partners in advocacy agree with HR 40. We're going to encourage them to get more actively involved and to support more specifically.
Thank you for that, Tom Steyer. And the great Congresswoman Shiela Jackson-Lee will leave the last word to you.
Well, all of you have been so passionate in this presentation. I almost don't want to leave you. I want to thank NMPA and my president for his, how should I say, blood he left in the fight for justice. And thank you, Stacey, for your journalism. Tom has been a wonderful collaborator, and his team is superb. And so I certainly hope that we can expand our social media, as you have asked us to do, to be able to utilize some of those influencers themselves that are in the movement that Tom has created. And certainly we know that voting is of paramount importance, because we want a passionate leader, and Joe Biden will certainly serve in that position. But as we talk about now, let me just say these 2-3 words on my constituents, and that is the family of George Floyd. And if you see them, they are loving people. They're wanting George Floyd's heinous murder to be a seismic earthquake-like change, not only for America, but for the world. Passing H.R. 40 in tandem with passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would equal the seismic change of 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I think Ben is right. We need to indicate to these young voters, all generations of them, that there are agenda items on the ballot that you can't see, but that will help to change their life and to change the construct of the treatment of African Americans and the question of racial injustice, so that the question of racial justice will be an obvious. So I think what we need is voting, but we also need the influencers to engage civically, to get as much support as possible. Reach out to your member of Congress. That's allowed. That's what democracy is all about. Ask them whether or not they're on HR 40 in the most friendliest of manner. Remember, I started out by saying I don't come to this in anger or with anguish. I come to this factually based and with a sense of moral presence, but I also come to it with an acknowledgement of the length and the depth and the power and the tragedy of our history. But I'm reminded that our ancestors who worked from sunup to the next sun want us to get it done, to do it. And in our traditions, we know that they will hear us. We will speak to them and they will hear us by our actions, and they will be proud that the likes of Tom Steyer, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, John Legend, Danny Glover, the NFL, various sports organizations, and eons and eons and eons of civic groups are standing in the gap with us, but they want us to simply do it. And John Robert Lewis, the boy from Troy, who called everyone, the beloved community, is listening and watching us today.
Well, Shiela Jackson Lee, the Congresswoman from the great state of Texas, we really appreciate you. And Tom Steyer, absolutely appreciate you as well. Dr. Chavis, your history, it speaks for itself as well. So it's been a great conversation on a very important topic. HR 40, it's the reparations bill authored by Shiela Jackson Lee of Texas. We thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're going to continue this topic as the days and weeks go forward. You can rest assured, as Dr. Chavis has promised, you'll see a lot of it in the pages of the Black Press of America. Thank you all for watching. On Monday, we continue our conversations with the Congressional Black Caucus. We'll have Representative Alcee Hastings on Monday. Tune in then, and everyone have a great weekend. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Ben, thank you so very much.